Hello.
Hi.
Hello. Afternoon.
Hi, Shane.
Yeah. Um, how long do we typically wait around for late joiners? I'm looking at the agenda. It looks like we're still missing Yakov and Martine, maybe.
Yes, so the agenda looks pretty empty today, which is also because Michael is on the other side of the world, and it's 4 a.m., I guess.
I've heard about today being maybe cancelled, but then
Yeah,
no.
yeah, but it's not
Yeah.
officially canceled, so that's the reason why I joined, just to clarify. Yeah, so it's 3 a.m. Yeah, it could be that Martin and Michael communicated something between each other. That's the reason why Martin doesn't join. But we can wait another minute and have waited 5 minutes. Yeah, so I guess we know each other. And if no one has something spontaneously for the agenda, then I guess we can also skip this meeting too.
It's hard to continue without Michael. But there are a few issues open we could kind of discuss on those.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah, I'd be willing to discuss some of the issues. Even if also, I think if for those who aren't aware, there is actually quite a bit of discussion happening in issues right now in the GraphQL spec repo, which is separate from the GraphQL working group or composite working group repo. So just like as a call out maybe for the recording too, if for people watching later, we definitely comment on some of the issues. But yeah, John, I like your idea of maybe is there one in particular that people want to discuss while we got everyone on the call?
Taking a look now.
You mean that the discussion on the composite schema work group, or the spec, right?
The spec, yeah.
Spec, yes.
I think one of the open items on the issues, I think, is just fixing terminologies for the spec, like discussions around supergraph, subgraph usage, as opposed to subschema. I think Michael had created this issue, if I recall this correctly. So maybe getting us a consensus on what the right term is and moving forward with that.
Yeah, Benji brought up some good points that he had concern about just using broadly the term graph to describe what was actually the schema documents, as the core GraphQL spec doesn't really use that term either. So I think Benji's concern was that even if somehow we use a bunch of words, it should probably end with schema or have schema as a part of it in some phrase, which I totally agree with. I think that makes sense. I think Martijn had proposed the idea that just the general idea of source schema doesn't really describe what that is, because like every single schema is like a source schema for everything, I guess. And so I think there's an attempt to make it distinct, like the schemas that go through the composition process are different than the schemas that come out of the composition process. And also this spec would probably loosely have to define that not every single GraphQL schema can go through the composition process either too. So it's not just probably any GraphQL schema. There has to be like something unique about it. So what are those schemas that go through the composition process, I guess, is the first question. Today, the terms are probably subgraph schemas, composition source schemas. There's some other terms thrown out, but composite schemas.
There are at least two schemas coming out of the composition, right? There is the annotated schema with the internal schema for the execution. And then there is the public schema, which is exposed. So that's at least two different terminologies for these two schemas. And then there's at least one, maybe two for the ones that flow into, right? That would be the ones that compose and the ones that don't.
So in the overview section, there is some definitions for source schema and composite schema.
I'm almost tempted to call the resulting schema just a GraphQL schema. There's no reason it couldn't be used again in another layer of composition. And it simply implements the GraphQL spec, right? So I can kind of see what sub-schema should mean, in that context, right? It's the only one that's tweaked to work with something else. Whereas the supergraph or graph is just the larger normal valid schema,
Sorry, I'm trying to take notes also, so make sure we want to try to get something down. So you're saying it could just be called a GraphQL schema as the input,
or rather the opposite, the end result, the public schema that we've been talking about, like that is the GraphQL schema. Like there's not like, it already exists as a term, right? That one is the same definition as the one that the GraphQL spec describes. How it is executed is slightly different, but the observable behavior should be the same.
Yeah, correct. The observable behavior to a client is that it has no extra stuff. It's just a GraphQL schema that it can query. I think the need for terms is still there though, to distinct. If we just, as you're reading the spec, I say what today Apollo Federation calls the API schema. Like if I say that term, if I say something about the API schema, you know what that means, and that's not the one with all the metadata. That's not the input schema. That's the one that the clients are reading. That's just the basic schema. So I think there's still a need to have a term to describe that, which is the scheme, the composed schema without annotations. It's not a great term, but like that's what it is, right? Even if we call it that, there should be some term that we keep using to refer to that document.
Yeah, we need
Yeah.
3 different terms, and whenever the spec uses them, we should use spec-MD to link to a proper definition.
Yeah. Reading through the issue, are we all? I think we're not even clear how many different schemas we need to name, right? So
Well, we
I
know
guess
that
we
3,
need-
right?
Well, are there 3?
There's the original like service, we'll call it microservice for now for simplicity, like that.
Subgraph schema, the composed schema with the annotations, and the one without. But Jane just before said that there might be a 4th one, the ones that are not subgraphs, just normal things, just graphical APIs that do not compose. So I
Sure.
think we should just treat them also as possible subgraphs, whatever source schemas, and then just say it's source schemas that do not compose. Because then we don't only have to name 3 things. Well, I guess, do we have like sets of names that we have a selection on? Because the discussion in the issue is great. I guess we just need some.
I think these 2 terminologies, like subgraph or supergraph or subschema or supergraph schema, these come in context of composition, right? And not everybody creates a GraphQL server with composition in mind. Like they're just probably like creating one simple GraphQL API with a simple schema. So I think these terminologies have to be like put in the context of composition. So once they start expanding their scope of the GraphQL API itself, which is to just merge or like compose across multiple schemas, that's when these terms make sense. And I think I only probably see right now 2 of these, which is you have multiple of these independent schemas, which you just compose into this one single schema. So now what are these multiple single schemas called? And what is the combined schema, the composed schema called eventually, just from a terminology perspective? And that's where I think probably I visualize this. And there are some terminologies mentioned in the issue, like public schema and whatnot. I think it may or may not be public, right? And public could mean that it's exposed as an API to everybody to consume, but then it may not necessarily be that. It could be an internal admin-only API for whatever reason, right? So yeah, I'd probably eliminate the usage of public. So which then brings into like, what are these 2 terminologies? Like the independent schemas, which may or may not have any annotations or relationships between them. And then what is a composed schema, which has the annotations between all of these schemas. So there's only 2 that I can visualize right now conceptually, but I'm happy to get more thoughts on this.
Yeah, so I guess we just haven't made it clear for everyone, maybe that, as Pascal said, there is actually 3 schemas, maybe even 4 if you want to consider it, that term. So we all agree we're defining the process of composition, right? So what we need to have a term for is GraphQL schemas as input. Today, those are commonly known as subgraph schemas, source schemas, mergeable schemas, whatever you want to call them. You could argue for the fact that maybe we have a term for non-composable schemas that are not subgraph compatible or whatever you like that too. But that's negating those. So those are the inputs to composition. So there's at least 1, maybe 2 of negating the term there, but we need to find that term. And then the output is we go through a composition process. the output we get from that, currently defined by the spec, and also how all the other composing implementations work, is you produce one compose schema which has a bunch of metadata, so that at runtime your gateway, your router, whatever you call it, can actually understand, oh, someone queried this field, I need to go to that that other server over there. So it has a bunch of metadata, but we also don't want to expose that metadata to clients. So we actually have another schema that is like, take that compose schema and strip it of all its metadata. So you just have the unified types, and we call that the client schema or the API schema today. So those are the three definitions we definitely have. We need to have well defined for the spec, so that, and where else we reference them, as Simon pointed out, we can go link back to them, have the spec tooling, like, so that's the goal. Is everyone not clear on that part? Yeah, okay, great. So I think there's the discussion there that's been moving forward, and there's a lot of ideas. Does anyone, I think what we really just need is like more ideas. So maybe just like a quick, like 2-minute brainstorming session. I'm going to look at the clock here, like just start throwing out ideas, names, and I'll write them down. And then we'll maybe like, I'll get some ideas flowing in people's heads.
Yeah, thinking from the gateway perspective, we do have theoretically also something like the gateway schema. Though with supergraph gateway, with super schema, gateway schema, public schema, all these terminologies, it's really hard sometimes to make the differentiation between the thing that you query and the thing that's annotated. Because the gateway schema could be the one that you expose, but it could also be the one that's annotated, because it's just one of the two schemas which is somehow involved in the gateway.
Yep.
It could also be argued that the executable schema is also an implementation detail. Like, we could recommend it as an option, but it is not necessarily the way it's implemented.
It's fine, but you need to have it in the spec to talk about it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you could give it a less ideal name because it's, a choice, right? It's maybe the executable gateway schema, for example.
Yeah, executable would be also something for consideration. For subgraphs, we often call them also downstream services. So there's also the downstream schema, downstream schemas. I think downstream is actually not even mentioned somewhere here.
Benji's point about calling them services as a viable alternative might be good too. I see a couple references to it in the spec already. It seems like the spec talks about it as a single service, and this would change it into multiple services.
Yep, I like that too. The service is, I think, a good distinction, because we do, I think I called out in the last comment there too, because we are going to have schemas and services, and I think that's a good distinction of, Pascal, as you mentioned, like there's the runtime portion, which is, we're not going to strictly probably define with this spec, but we still need to be able to reference it and define it, that the runtime is separate from the composition process. And so I think having to be able to say like the service versus the schema, so you have like the subgraph service and the subgraph schema. I think those are two distinct things, and using those is very helpful too. But other ways we could think of it is like, just, I think it's mentioned in the issue, but like the composition schemas, source schemas, those are all ideas. Any other terms people have heard from maybe someone who doesn't know federation or composition and what they call them when they first start learning?
I mean, there is also something for, do we have composed schema and merge schema on the list?
Sure, I'll add it to the list.
I mean, it's just another two things which I've heard.
If we really want a sacrilegious name, we could say stitched.
Oh,
yep,
dangerous one.
I think we can agree that's the worst one.
Well, I can definitely produce. Whereas
Woven schemas. We had our first effort at doing our custom stitching was called the Weaver. So we call them.
Hi, I'm Ben. This is my first time attending. I work for Google. I do a lot of our GraphQL stuff there. I will say I like composed or merged. Our execution model that we use internally is very different from what we've heard about before from external cases and third parties. So yeah, something that doesn't have that weight, as I think, John, you mentioned, as far as like implications for how it's implemented. So something that's more generic, like composed or merged, I really like personally, because that matches our model as well. Whereas the other names, not so much.
Right. Hey, Ben, if this is your first meeting, just wanted to highlight, did you add yourself to the agenda in the working group GitHub repo?
I did not yet, but I will do that. Thank you.
awesome.
It won't get merged now because we're already started, but for future meetings, this is usually a little more structured. Today, the main leaders of the working group are not in attendance, so we're just having a little bit of brainstorming session, but for future meetings, feel free to add yourself to that agenda and topics too at a time.
Cool. Thank you.
Okay, so I think we got some good ideas. I can take all those and add them to the issues, just brainstorming ideas. Do we think with this time here, do we think we're probably all going to agree on one, or do we think it's still something that we maybe just continue discussing in the issue with a bunch more ideas and
Yeah, I would let that sink in, especially as Martin and Michael are not here. It would be good to let their thoughts also come together. So I would say if we just add this to the issue, and then I think is it the next one? No, it's the first. Is it the first one? The big work group. The first one of the month or the last one of the month?
First one of the month.
First one of the month. Yeah, then we can probably have the concrete decision discussion in the first week of March. Makes sense. So then we can flex it. I guess only a list of names doesn't make sense. I guess we need to have a list of names with also the reasoning behind why we want these names or why we don't like these names. Then we can make a decision at some point.
Yeah, for what it's worth, the idea we've had in previous sessions has been the name will kind of pop out of what the implementation, or rather the spec, will look like. So we don't have to be super picky about the name yet. Just something that's not the worst option.
True.
I guess while we're at it, and if we want to keep on the naming trend, there's another discussion on what do we call the gateway router thing, the runtime part. Is that something we want to do a little brainstorming while we got everyone on the call too?
Sure.
Which issue is this? This is the
issue 17.
Yep, I see.
So I'll paste the link here in chat. So for everyone else, the issues or idea here is like, what's the term for what we've been describing? You compose a schema and you get this merged, composed, super graph schema, all the terms there, but you need a thing to run that to be able to also do all the coordination and everything. So today, that's like the Apollo router, the Cosmo router, the WonderGraph, Cosmo router, all the other implementations, the Stitcher, the Weaver, all those things. So other ideas about that were like gateway, orchestrator, coordinator.
Yeah.
So
Do we know why gateway wasn't chosen over router? For Apollo, sorry.
if I can actually provide some background on that. So we actually have used the term gateway initially when we first adopted the idea of federation. And we launched that as a product, right? So there's the Apollo Gateway, the NPM package. And then when we took the effort to rewrite it and rebuild the runtime and from JavaScript to Rust, we needed a new name. So we decided to distinct it as Apollo Router as an entirely separate product, which had the same features of Gateway, but that's why we did that switch to have a more, and not just call it like Gateway 2.0, because like we wanted to still support the Gateway and still have that upgrading versions as needed too. So
I kind of agree with Benji here that router feels. I'm not sure about router. It would be interesting to know how you ended up with that name, because there are so many other names which could theoretically be used, right? So what was if we know the deciding factor for router, then maybe it makes sense for me, because there are patterns like this that have names like the coordinator, whatever, orchestrator, although orchestrator is more for infrastructure, but
yeah, I wasn't on the engineering team who primarily worked on like the initial ideas, and I think router was on the idea pretty early on, honestly. I think Martijn would be a good one to get more insights from that. So if you wanted to tag him on that issue and like, hey Martijn, why did Apollo come with the router name? Or Simon, do you have more context on that? I know you might have been around, but I don't know if you were in those discussions.
I joined slightly after the router was already started.
Okay. All right.
So I'm not sure about the name.
So is it the only opposition to Gateway it was used? Can't use it again. It can cause too much confusion.
But for this specification, we don't have to stick to a single word. It can be 2 words or more. Like the overview currently uses distributed executor.
yeah, that's quite a mouthful though.
But
Specs often are.
if we want
It's a
to
good
be
idea though. I mean,
Yeah.
I can't think of a better one that fully describes what it's doing.
On the other hand, if we just say gateway to someone who doesn't have the context, doesn't mean much. So we could use it, but we'd have to have a proper definition for within this document. This is what gateway means, or whatever word means.
And we probably can't call it resolver for other reasons.
Yeah, I mean, that's an idea, like the supergraph compose schema resolver. I think this is getting a little into the weeds, but the implementation today, this
more, right?
part doesn't do resolving, actually. It just does the coordination of what should be the request sent to the downstream subgraph service, and then that does the resolving, but that's the implementation too.
I think resolver is pretty well established as a function that resolves one field.
Yeah, but it also weaves it together, right? It creates it not only, it does multiple things. First of all, it plans what the execution looks like. Then it executes the requests and sends the request, and then it composes from the request the result together. Now Composer is already used, which is a bit sad, so they cannot use this.
Yeah, we call the,
or where's that one?
sorry, can you say that again, Ben or John?
Yeah, where did you see Composer? Was that in the current spec or?
No, but if you talk about Composer, isn't it somehow the thing that composes the schemas? If you talk about composing schemas into a supergraph schema, then you would assume that the composer also is the part which takes the subgraph schemas, downstream schemas, and creates the supergraph whatever schema, right? That from the terminology, you would imply that the composer would be the thing that composes, I guess.
Well, if we want to take like a music metaphor, this could be the director.
Mhm.
So the composer created the piece and the director runs the show.
Yeah,
Conductor.
conductor.
Love that analogy.
Just there is like, there's the term API gateway is often referred to the thing that does, I take a request in and I route it to some other service out there. So I guess I'll call that out as like this, in theory, these could be just GraphQL API gateways, right? Like something to that degree, or and that's kind of where gateway itself just as a standalone term came from too.
Now I'm loving conductor too much. Someone come up with a different one.
If we have conductors, we need to have trains as well.
Yeah, I mean,
Now I'm stuck wanting to call the services players or something.
Yeah, I think we probably want to stick away from the
Yeah.
tube stuff. That's what we did with, as I said, my first implementation was like weaving and looms and threads. It got cheesy, so we don't want to do that in this spec.
Conducting kind of makes sense though. It has a couple different meanings in different industries, so that could possibly work.
what could work?
Conductor or conducting, yeah, however you want to phrase that one. It's both the part that is executing the piece, if you want to keep the metaphor going. If you don't, then it's executing the request and then distributing that to the things that actually, implement or resolve those pieces.
I don't think metaphors are great for a specification.
Yeah, I'm not suggesting the metaphor here. I'm just it came up as part of that. Like a conductor role generally is to farm out tasks, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's also already a product which is named that way.
Sorry, I missed that. What did you say, Pascal?
There's already a graphical conductor. That could be a bit confusing. But I mean, the spec, again, it's terminology, right? It's not something that has to be final now. So,
Of course.
I would do it the same way as we did it with the other names. Let's write more into these issues, and then we can think about it more. I mean, the thing that Benji wrote there is also not so bad. The coordinator is also something because it coordinates the request, right? But yeah, I mean, it's either or, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think we can do the same thing here. We did a small little brainstorm on the call. I'll share this in the issue, and we'll continue discussion there. While we have everyone still here, I think we can maybe move on to another issue that's maybe open. Is there anything else that is on people's mind or anything they want to discuss with the group? I will call out then. We haven't had a meeting since the primary meeting, the first one, the February. And in the action item from that, the ask was for everyone to go and approve or comment on section 1 of the spec, which is currently really just the intro section, but we're still having like suggestions even in that part there. So I think I'm not going to set timelines, but I think it would probably be good if we start getting that part probably closed or getting close to close. So if you still have any last comments, that's still a to do for everyone.
On that topic, I made a pull request against the overview. The pull request is approved. Is there anything else I need to do? I don't have right access to the repo.
That's a good question. I don't either. I think that probably a good one for Benji or Martine or Michael.
Martin and I think Martin, definitely Benji has right access, and I think Martin and Michael as well.
I think Benji approved it.
Mhm. I bet if you comment, Benji.
It does show there's workflows waiting approval from a maintainer. So you're talking about PR 23. It looks like there's maybe some GitHub actions that run, which haven't run yet, because it requires a maintainer to approve to run them. Yeah, so you don't abuse GitHub actions running code.
Oh, that's right. There's workflows awaiting approval. I don't know what those workflows are though.
It does the build of the spec and produces like the actual HTML document. Make sure it's all like it can build with the spec library.
I think they have to approve new contributors. It's like not automatic.
I'll ask Benji in a thread.
Okay.
So
Any
Shane,
other? Yeah, go ahead.
You're dropping all the new names in, and we could start discussion from there.
Yep. So I've been taking notes in the shared note doc. Usually Benji does a great job of taking notes, but I try to do as my best as I can. I'll comment all those on the individual issues, both the schema namings and then gateway namings. And yeah, everyone, we can continue discussion there.
Sounds great.
There's one issue that you opened, John. Maybe you want to elaborate on this one.
We can, yeah.
I mean, we still have time, so maybe you can just always easier than to write, right?
I got knocked down a peg on confidence on this one. Where is that one?
21.
21. I'll post the link. So this one, it's a bit more of like I'm surprised by this kind of syntax in GraphQL. And the gist was when we're providing a field selection or a schema coordinate as is currently described in the spec, it's a string, but it's like essentially a scalar, but it looks like a selection set from a query. That to me is kind of surprising. I would like to see if we can support some other kind of syntax that's more familiar. Maybe it is directly a selection set instead of a scalar. Something like that would be nice.
Yeah, we've explored a lot of things with this with the initial stitching approach that we had. We also went into the fragment space for a bit just to explore. The thing is the schema coordinate now is a thing.
Okay.
This coordinate is in the GraphQL spec already quite far. And from there on, it's just a tooling issue. Because once it's in the GraphQL spec, the schema coordinate will be known, so we can have tooling also treat this differently than just a string. Goes into the same direction that we had with the one of the whole input union discussion, which is ongoing. Actually, one of them is now nearly close, but it's the same thing. It's a tooling issue at some point, and no longer a design issue. For the selection set, I think one thing which definitely is an issue is when you would have to write a big selection set into it. Although I'm not sure that this is really a case. I mean, I don't know, maybe Jaden, some keys. How many, what's the most amount of keys that you have seen in a key directive?
Quite a lot. And also they can be nested as far as you want to, right?
Yeah, true. That's true.
So
But is
I
it
think
common
that
to have, is it common to have like 10 keys?
I've seen
10
it for sure, more than 10. It's, now I always ask, like, why do you have that many keys? I think some people started abusing that concept of federation because when you use a key, it starts sending that field to all the different subgraphs, and you use it, you can kind of like abuse it as a way to like force send those fields
I
to
see.
across the
But
subgraph.
But that's a really good insight, because if people abuse this field, that could also lead to something that we actually could solve as a problem.
Yeah.
You know, if people require this, required to have the subgraph data, to have the data and the subgraph, then this could be maybe a concept that we could add to the specification, which doesn't need to be, we just specify all the fields as keys.
No, it is a good point because what ideally today with Apollo Federation, how you'd solve this would be you'd go to your schema where you needed that data and you require it. So you have to go to your destination and pull it in. But with that key, what you're actually doing is you're saying everyone, regardless of what you do, you have to refer to by this thing. But people are kind of abusing that and say everyone has to refer to this thing, so I can tell in the definition of it, just send this to everyone, even if they like don't ask for it, quote unquote. So it's like, it's like force send this out to everyone, even if, and the entity, even if they don't ask for it in some ways. So it's like not requires, it's like a push concept, right?
Does in Federation, does every subgraph need to implement all the keys? No.
No, actually, no. You can have,
No.
and you don't even need to have matching keys across all the things. It's
Can it
client
be,
is quite smart. It can like figure out, oh, that key joins the
But-
subgraph here by that key, and I take that one and go to that one, and that one go to that one, and it can like go
Sat-
around and figure out a path.
satisfiability rule will be terrible to do, but yeah.
It is, but it figures it out. But kind of getting back to the original question, John, I think Pascal brought up a good point, which is how do we satisfy multiple fields as a key or selection set, something like that. With schema coordinates, I mean, it would just have to be an array, but is that like an array of, okay, I require product dot price, product dot status, product dot field. Like you have to keep repeating yourself over and over again, which is why
It
we have
doesn't work because you cannot do paths, so you cannot nesting. You cannot do nesting.
So this was kind of a positing that this is a surprising syntax to me. The coordinate sounds like it's already in there, but this field selection set, it doesn't seem like there's an existing concept there. Benji linked to something I haven't had a chance to look at yet, but if it resembled a selection, then I think I would be less surprised. I imagine many others would probably also be less surprised, but I can't assume that.
Yeah, I mean, the only the only selection that you can do without breaking existing syntax, which he said we don't want to have new syntax for composition in a couple of meetings now. We want to have the always valid graphical syntax. There shouldn't be something on top that just exists in this composite schema world. Then the only way to express a selection set is either through a type, a fragment, or a query. Right.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, actually, in the type, it's not even a selection set. I was wrong. So the only way to express a selection set is either in a query or in a fragment.
And that's effectively what the strings are, is queries, right?
Yeah.
The queries of the field, we're defining them inside of that.
Yeah, and that my first terrible idea was just put the name of a fragment there as opposed to the type.
I mean, it's not so terrible. We've been there too. We've tried this out. We've tried this out.
Please riff on it. I'm sure we can do something better.
I mean, you know, the question is what, because that's one of the only places to do it.
But schemas normally don't contain fragment definitions. So
You
if you start doing that, it's pretty much the same as your syntax.
But it would not be new syntax. So the SEL document doesn't need to be only one or the other type of syntax nodes.
So even with it looks weird because I'm maybe not used to it, is there other ways? Just trying to really think about, I guess, how Federation does it today with just, I can say ID, right? Or ID space name. And that just looks like I'm kind of writing just random strings and we just sort of magically figure it out. Like, would tooling that actually like can autocomplete those strings for you, or any of those better, like you have to be explicit and have the brackets, as Benji commented. Is there any other things that you think would help it not seem weird, as you described? Because, you know.
Yeah, the surprise for me is that it's in a string. It's strange to express something that's selecting fields as a scalar. Right? We already have tools and language to describe field selection. This is a bit strange that we're choosing to put it inside of a string. I get it from a, you know, we can't change the spec because, you know, we're not GraphQL, so we're going to add the spec on top and put it inside a string. Makes sense. I think if we have the opportunity to make it a little bit more native to how you would express this in GraphQL, I think it would go a long way to helping people understand it.
I agree that conceptually it's not great because we have a GraphQL language, and to read documents you need a parser. But inside of that you have string values, and then you use another GraphQL parser to parse that value. And if you ever need something like escaping, you can end up having double escaping, which doesn't feel great. So fortunately, it doesn't happen in the most common cases because it's just field names that are usually ASCII.
I mean, in the key directive, you would never have input, right?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
In the key directive, where you know double escaping would be, you're in a string, so you would need the string marker, so we'd have to escape it. That would never happen in this specific case because you would not use inputs in key directives, right?
Federation doesn't allow for that today, but like, would the spec want to allow for that? Because I guess you could statically define like an argument, and that could be a directive, or regardless of the argument, like the field is still considered a key. That's kind of weird, just in the sense of what you're describing with the schema, but like from a definition perspective, I guess that could be okay. But
Yeah, from a programmer perspective, you can have arguments inside of fields. I'm not sure why you would do that.
I mean, yeah.
but do that.
If it is just a real selection set in a string, if it's defined like this, right? Then it's also possible to have directives inside. So you could nest the key directives inside the strings of key directives.
Yes, that too.
But yeah, anyway.
It does anything, but the parser will pass it.
One question. So this key directive exists for a while now, right? Is there tooling around it that just exists? Like, is there any modified version of the GraphQL language server that already supports these selection sets?
not that I know of. The tooling would just be composition, which validates the selection set. So running composition to know that it's completely valid. So if this became a GraphQL spec thing, then maybe that could be something that had better LSP support.
Yeah, I understand your point too, John, by the way. It's not, I don't think it's bad, because we've played not in the context of distributed or composite schemas, but we've played around with other ideas where it would be really good to have a way to specify some sort of selection set as an argument to a directive or something like this. When you go into rewriting of a schema and stuff like this, it would be really nice even to use directives inside the arguments of directives and stuff like this. So I'm not sure. I mean, if we go, I guess the only really option for a proper selection set that we have would be the fragment. Everything else would not work. This has a few gotchas, like it's usually not normal to have fragments and types in the same documents, as one is for execution, the other one is for type definitions. Then another thing would be that you'd have a lot of fragments for a single entity, because you often define multiple keys for the same entity. So then you would have to have different fragments for the different keys.
Yep.
And yeah. A second idea would be that we change the spec, but then it would be an issue that we have to do on the GraphQL specification repository. That usually takes quite a long time.
I think using fragment definitions in schemas means modifying what is the grammar of a valid schema document. And to me, it's not that much more simple than modifying a grammar of what is a value to say values can be selection sets. I'm not sure we want that, either of that, but both of them are pretty much grammar changes.
Yeah.
Yeah, the current selection set the tooling there could be better improved. I agree. And it's in theory not that difficult, because what we're implicitly saying is, even with how Apollo Federation composes stuff today, is like when you start a key or a requires field or anything, like you're writing it in context of this subgraph, what I see. And this subgraph here, it doesn't know about all the other fields, the other subgraphs. So if I have a product type, and let's say as its ID, its name, and its price, and like an in-stock option, right? So in the in-stock field, I can require stuff. I must point at stuff that's like defined in this subgraph. I can't just point at a completely other field that maybe does exist in the supergraph. It has to be like defined and referenced in this subgraph. So in that context, key fields and everything like an LSP can simply look at the type definition and be like, here are all the fields here. Like I can pre-parse that and know, oh, you're opening up a field selection string. Here's all your options, right? Like, and I just looked below basically. So it's quite easy. It would be easy to have that because it's so explicit. Like you can't just reference anything random. So that's there.
Yeah, but that's also twofold, because one thing is only parsing and having the grammar, and the other thing is already validation on the parsed thing. So it's two things. To say that a field is only referenceable from the context of this subgraph means that that's something else than just having a valid grammar, right?
Yes.
Already imply, if you say this, the scalar means that whatever, it's this syntax, then you cannot imply that it's also, I mean, you could, but then it's also validation and not only parsing.
Yeah. I think it's probably worth calling out somewhere in this composite schema spec that how when you look at a schema today for federation, this is like sort of the rule that we have for Fed 2. If you look at that alone, like it alone is like a completely valid schema. Like it doesn't need another schema to be like its own valid standalone schema. So you can always reference it and run it by itself, and you can see this thing is pointing at a field right there, and it's defined in the same subgraphs. So I guess that's what I'm specifically calling out, is like if you're referencing something with that field selection set, it must exist within the same schema document, right? So you potentially have all the metadata for doing some sort of autocomplete tooling. All right. While we're nearing the time that we had scheduled for today, I have more notes again in the shared Google Doc. For this one, is there anything that we need to comment back on the main issue, or just everyone can take a look at issue 21 and raise any of the points brought up here if you want to? John, I guess I'll leave it up to you. Anything you want to take away from this last minute for your issue?
Yeah, Simon, I think you had a couple counter arguments. Would you mind adding those to the issue? And then I think we also described a couple. I admit I'm having trouble following some of the discussion because it's above my head, but I think the main counter argument was this is not having a fragment in the schema document is changing the GraphQL spec, right?
I'm not sure. I think in the grammar it should. I'm not sure if it actually violates the spec. Does it?
There is a grammar for executable documents and another one for type system document. There is yet another one for document, which can contain anything, but then you also accept operations.
Yeah, you
And
can technically write operations and schema.
In our implementation, at least, that particular grammar is only useful for test cases, where you have to describe a schema for your specific test, and immediately you have a query that against that schema. But aside from that, I don't know if there is any use for executable documents in the same file as a schema.
Yeah. So I guess the main thing we need to figure out if we do anything remotely similar to what I dropped in there is figure out if this is a change to the GraphQL schema and if that's worth pursuing.
Yeah, so looking at the grammar, it just says then it's, I mean, did you reference the appendix, document syntax, or? Which part of the specification do you mean, Simon?
It's a bit all over the place.
Yeah. I just looked quickly at the appendix because I thought that I read it there. And
Right. I do want to be conscious of the time.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna have to drop off. I guess I don't know if this keeps recording, but I do want to sort of close the meeting since we didn't have everyone here. But feel free to stay on if you want and discuss. So I will, just to close, I'll comment on the other two issues, our brainstorming stuff. We do have the meeting next week. As right now, it's not canceled. So if you want to attend, add yourself to the agenda and topics. I think we've been missing those predefined topics. We'll get more people to probably attend to.
And I'll drop
Yep.
a comment on this issue, kind of summarizing what we talked about.
Awesome. Sounds good.
Okay. All right. Thanks, everyone.
I have to go
See ya.
to-